The letter arrived on a Tuesday in April, which Evelyn Marsh would later think was appropriate, because April in Vermont is the month of false promises. The mud has not yet decided to dry. The lilacs have not yet decided to open. The cold that comes down off the mountains at night still carries the memory of February inside it, even when the afternoon sun has made you foolish enough to leave your coat inside. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. She found it beneath a stack of grocery circulars and electric bills she carried in from the mailbox every Tuesday, without looking at them first. She set the stack on the kitchen counter, put the kettle on, and stood at the window watching a pair of chickadees argue over the feeder she had hung from the sugar maple the week after Gerald died. Gerald had put up that feeder the summer of 2008. She had kept the birds in sunflower seed since October of 2021. 16 months. She had not counted the months intentionally. The months had simply counted themselves. She went through the circulars first, the way she always did, because the coupons for the grocery on Main Street were printed on newsprint that bled ink onto the envelopes underneath if you stacked them wrong. Then the electric bill. Then the notice from the library board about the spring fundraiser she had promised to help organize. Even though she had retired 18 months ago, and the new director had rearranged the reference section in a way that made her fingers itch every time she walked past. The envelope from the law office in Rutland was at the bottom of the pile. Cream-colored, heavy stock, with the return address printed in that particular shade of dark green that law firms in small New England cities tend to favor. The name on the return address was Bellows and Crane, attorneys at law, with an address on Merchants Row that Evelyn associated with the kind of work she had never needed done. Wills, trusts, the administration of estates. She opened it standing at the kitchen counter with the kettle beginning to whistle behind her. The letter was 3 paragraphs. It informed her that her maternal aunt, Dorothy Hargrove, formerly Dorothy Marsh of Woodstock, Vermont, had died on the 14th of April at the age of 94 at Hargrove House in the town of Alderton, Vermont. It informed her that she was named as the sole beneficiary in Dorothy Hargrove's last will and testament, dated December of the previous year. It requested that she call the office at her earliest convenience to discuss the terms of the estate. Evelyn stood with the letter in one hand and the kettle going on behind her, and she thought about a box of books. She had been 11 years old. It was the summer her father had the row with Dorothy, the particular row about the family house in Woodstock that Evelyn had never fully understood and had spent most of her adult life reconstructing from second-hand accounts. The row had ended with Dorothy driving away in a green Buick that nobody else in the family thought was roadworthy and not coming back for 7 years. 2 months after the row, a box of books had arrived at Evelyn's house with a note in handwriting she had not yet learned to recognize. The note said, "For Evelyn, because you are the one who asked about the library. Your Aunt Dorothy." The box contained 14 books. A collection of Chekhov stories in a translation Evelyn had read 3 times by the time she was 13. The complete poems of Emily Dickinson in a small cloth-bound edition with Dorothy's own marginal notes in pencil, a private conversation her aunt had been having with the dead poet for what looked like several years. A first edition of Jane Eyre that Evelyn had kept in a box under her bed for 20 years before Gerald had talked her into having it appraised. The appraiser had said $1,500. Gerald had whistled. Evelyn had put it back under the bed. That was how she had known Dorothy. Not from family dinners Dorothy did not attend or holidays she slipped away from before the pie. From boxes of books that arrived without warning, 4 or 5 times across Evelyn's adult life. Each one with a note that assumed a conversation already in progress, the way Dorothy had always communicated, as if the years between letters were nothing more than a long breath taken between sentences. She turned off the kettle. She sat down at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her and the tea unmade. She had not seen Dorothy in 9 years. The last time had been a Tuesday in October, a drive up through the mountains on a day when the maples were past their peak, but still holding enough color that the ridgeline looked like something was burning slowly behind it. Dorothy had been 85 and sharp as a pin and had made Evelyn eat an entire pot of soup before she would let her look at the library. The library had been extraordinary. 3 walls of books from floor to ceiling with a rolling ladder on a brass track, a pair of wing chairs by a fireplace that still drew cleanly, a long table under a window that faced east. Dorothy had not left the house in the last 4 years of her life. Evelyn had known this from a neighbor in Alderton, a woman named Frances Park who had called twice a year to say that Dorothy was fine. Dorothy had groceries. Dorothy was working in the library. Frances had not said what Dorothy was working on. Evelyn had not asked, because with Dorothy you did not ask. You waited. She called the law office the next morning. The attorney who handled the estate was a woman named Patricia Crane, the younger of the two partners, 50-ish, with the kind of careful voice that suggested she had given difficult news enough times to have developed a specific pace for it. She offered her condolences. She confirmed the terms of the will. She said the estate consisted of the property at 14 Hargrove Lane, Alderton, Vermont, including the house, the grounds, and all contents therein. Evelyn asked about the state of the house. Miss Crane paused, the kind of pause that contains information being organized before delivery. She said the house had not been professionally maintained for some years. She said the property had been assessed by the county the previous autumn for tax purposes and had come back valued at $43,000, which she noted was primarily the land value. The house itself having been assessed as a net liability given the cost of structural repairs needed. $43,000. Evelyn had been a school librarian for 31 years. She had a pension that covered her mortgage and her groceries and the electric bill, and not very much beyond that. The house she lived in was a colonial on Maple Street that she and Gerald had bought in 1987, and that she had spent 16 months discovering was too large for one person and too full of 34 years of shared life to think about leaving. She told Miss Crane she would drive to Alderton on Friday. She told no one in the family before she went. This was not a deliberate decision. It was simply that she had gotten into the car on Friday morning at 7 and driven north on Route 4, and it had not occurred to her to call anyone first. She had taken a thermos of coffee and her road atlas, which she knew was an anachronism, but which she preferred to the telephone navigation because it gave her the shape of the whole journey at once rather than one turn at a time. She stopped at a diner in Woodstock for a second cup and a piece of apple pie she did not need, but ordered anyway, because Dorothy had always said the apple pie in that diner was the best in the state. The woman behind the counter, who was perhaps 25 and had not been born when Dorothy had first made this pronouncement, brought the pie without comment. The town of Alderton was 14 miles north of Woodstock on a county road that wound through farmland and second-growth forest and past two covered bridges that still carried traffic. It had a post office, a general store, a congregational church with a white steeple, and a volunteer fire department with a sign out front that said Bingo Fridays. Hargrove Lane ran off the main road about a half-mile past the church, a gravel track through a stand of hemlocks that opened after a quarter-mile into a clearing. Evelyn stopped the car in the clearing and looked at the house for a long time before she got out. It was larger than she remembered. 3 stories of federal-style architecture in pale brick gone the color of old blood, with a front portico whose columns had not been painted since, at her best estimate, the early years of the Clinton administration. The windows on the second floor had mostly intact glass, but the shutters on the east side had come loose and 3 of them hung at angles that suggested they would not survive the next serious wind. The porch roof over the front door had developed a sag in the middle that had been developing for several years. The grounds were not so much overgrown as simply untended, which was a different condition. The grass was long. The old kitchen garden along the south wall had gone to a tangle of sumac and goldenrod, and whatever had seeded itself in the years since someone had last turned the soil. But the bones of the plantings were still there. The espaliered apple trees along the stone wall. The old rose canes that had gone woody but were still pushing out new growth along the bottom. The boxwood hedge along the front walk that had grown enormous and shapeless and magnificent. She got out of the car. The air smelled of hemlock and damp earth and the particular mineral smell of old brick warming in the April sun. The front door was unlocked. Miss Crane had mentioned this. Dorothy had not locked the front door in 40 years, a fact that the attorney had noted with the measured tone of someone who has learned not to editorialize about the habits of the deceased. She pushed the door open. The smell came out to meet her first. Books. The particular smell of old books, the vanilla and almond smell of paper aging slowly in a dry room, the underlying must of cloth bindings that had absorbed 50 years of winters and summers. She had spent 31 years in a room that smelled exactly like this. It went into her chest the way the smell of your own childhood home goes when you have not been in it for a long time. The front hall was dark. The ceiling was high. A staircase with a mahogany banister rose on the left, and on the right were two doors, both closed. Straight ahead at the end of the hall was a third door, partly open, and through the gap Evelyn could see books. She went straight there. The library at Hargrove House ran the full depth of the north wing, perhaps 60 feet long and 30 wide, with ceilings that cleared 14 feet, and 3 walls covered floor to ceiling in built-in shelves that looked to Evelyn's eye as if they had been there since the house was built. The shelves were full, not packed carelessly, the way boxes of books look when someone has run out of storage, but ordered. Every shelf was organized. Even from the doorway, she could see that the organization was not simply alphabetical, but something more complex, a system that would take time to understand. The long table under the east window was covered in papers. A pair of reading glasses sat on top of the papers. A cup with a dried ring of tea sat beside the glasses. A library lamp with a green glass shade stood dark at one end of the table, its cord running to the wall socket in the baseboard. Evelyn walked to the table and stood there for a moment without touching anything. She looked at the glasses. They were half-moon reading glasses, tortoiseshell, with a small chip in the left lens that Dorothy had been meaning to replace for as long as Evelyn could remember. She had been meaning to replace them the last time Evelyn visited. 9 years ago. She had not replaced them. She looked at the papers. They were a mixture of handwritten notes and printed pages annotated in Dorothy's hand, the same handwriting from the margins of the Dickinson poems, familiar and precise. The annotations ran in a shorthand Evelyn could not immediately read, abbreviations and symbols interspersed with words in 3 or 4 languages she could identify. French, Latin, what looked like Italian. She looked up at the walls of books. If you have ever walked into a room that was clearly someone's entire life, the room they had built and tended and loved for decades, and understood in the space of a single breath that the person who built it was gone and the room was yours now, then you will know what Evelyn felt standing in the library at Hargrove House on that April morning. It was not happiness. It was not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. It was more the feeling of being handed something enormously heavy and enormously precious, and not being certain your arms are strong enough for it. She sat down in one of the wing chairs by the fireplace. She had not meant to stay long. She was supposed to look at the house and drive back to Alderton to meet Ms. Crane at her satellite office at 2 in the afternoon. She sat down, and she did not get up for 40 minutes. The meeting with Ms. Crane at 2 o'clock was efficient and not particularly warm, which Evelyn did not mind. She had spent 31 years dealing with school administrators, and the particular brand of professional courtesy practiced by attorneys was familiar territory. Ms. Crane went through the contents of the will with methodical care. There was a checking account at the Alderton Savings Bank with a balance of $4,300, which would transfer to Evelyn upon completion of the estate process. There was a storage unit in Rutland registered in Dorothy's name, contents unknown, for which Evelyn would receive the key. There was the house and everything in it. That was all, Miss Crane said. She looked at Evelyn with the look of a woman who has been practicing law long enough to have opinions she does not always share. Dorothy had been very clear, she said, that the contents of the house were to remain undisturbed until Evelyn had sufficient time to assess them herself. She had written this into the will explicitly. Undisturbed. That was the word she had used. Evelyn asked whether there were other family members who might contest the will. Miss Crane said there were 2 cousins on the Hargrove side, a woman named Sandra Cutler in Burlington and her brother, Neil Hargrove, in Portland, Maine, both of whom had been notified and both of whom had been told the same thing by their own attorneys. Dorothy Hargrove's will was airtight, executed in full possession of her faculties, witnessed by 2 Alderton residents with no interest in the estate, and notarized by a county notary who had known Dorothy since 1978. Evelyn thanked her and drove home through the mountains in the April dusk with the atlas open on the passenger seat, and her mind going over the library the way she went over a new acquisition at the school library, cataloging what she had seen, placing it, trying to find the system. She called her daughter Mara that evening. Mara was 41 and lived in Boston with her husband and 2 children and a career in hospital administration that she described, when she described it at all, as basically being a librarian but for patient records, which Evelyn thought was generous to both professions. She told Mara about the house. She told her about the library. She said the property was assessed at $43,000, but that she thought the figure was probably not the whole story. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the careful voice she used when she was managing her mother, "Mom, is this a thing where you say you're just going to take a look, and then 6 months later you're living there?" Evelyn considered this honestly. "Possibly," she said. The cousins called that same week. Sandra first, on a Wednesday evening, in a voice calibrated to sound warm while communicating something else entirely. She said she was so sorry about Aunt Dorothy. Wasn't it a shock? She had always meant to drive up to Alderton more often, but life was so busy. You know how it is. She said she imagined Evelyn must be feeling overwhelmed. She said if there was anything at all she could do to help, and she meant anything, she hoped Evelyn would call. Neil called the next day. Neil was more direct. He said he had heard from a friend that the house was in rough shape. He said he had a contractor friend who could take a look, give her a real sense of what she was dealing with, no obligation. He said he knew Evelyn was retired and living on a fixed income, and he just wanted to make sure she was not getting herself into something financially. He said family needed to look out for family. Evelyn thanked them both. She said she would be in touch. She did not call Sandra back. She did not call Neil back. She had been a librarian for 31 years. She knew how to read what was between the lines. She went back to Hargrove House the following Saturday. She brought a notebook, a flashlight, her good rain boots, and a bag with enough food for 2 days in case she decided to stay. She let herself in with the key Ms. Crane had given her and went directly to the library and sat down at Dorothy's long table under the east window and began to read the papers Dorothy had left there. It took her 3 hours to understand the system. The papers were not random notes. They were an index. Dorothy had been building a catalog of the library's contents, a record that ran to several hundred pages in a combination of handwritten notebooks and typed pages revised and updated over what looked like several decades. The most recent entries were dated the previous October, 6 months before Dorothy died. The handwriting on those entries was smaller and shakier than in the earlier pages, but entirely legible and entirely precise. The catalog was organized by what Dorothy had labeled acquisition. Each entry listed an item, its condition, its provenance as Dorothy understood it, and a column labeled simply V, with a figure beside it that Evelyn initially read as a library accession number before she looked more carefully and understood that it was not. It was a value, a monetary value. She found the first figure that made her stop and read twice, a handwritten entry for something labeled Ori B. V. M. Parchment, Flemish circa 1410, purchased Bruges 1978, v. 380,000. She looked up from the paper. She looked at the wall of books. She found the entry number in the corner of the catalog page, a system of letters and numbers, and she got up and walked along the shelves until she found the corresponding label. She pulled the item from the shelf. It was a small volume in a brown leather binding, the leather old enough that it had gone the color of dark honey and soft as cloth at the corners. She opened it. The pages inside were parchment, real parchment, animal skin cured smooth and thin as onion skin, covered in Latin script in a hand so small and regular it looked mechanical even though she knew it was not. Around the margins, in ink the color of a summer sky and paint the color of raw copper, were illuminations. Small figures. A woman in a blue robe. An angel with wings of gold leaf that still held their brightness after 600 years. She stood in the library of Hargrove House, holding a Flemish illuminated manuscript from 1410 in her hands. She put it back on the shelf very carefully. She went back to the catalog. She turned pages slowly now. V. 210,000. V. 485,000. V1. 2M. The M appeared for the first time on the 14th page of the catalog, and she stopped breathing for a moment. She counted the entries on the first 14 pages. 47 entries. She turned to the back of the catalog. The last entry number was 412. 412 items. Not all with significant values. There were entries for $10, $20, ordinary books that Dorothy had simply liked or found useful. But the items with high valuations were distributed throughout the catalog with a regularity that suggested Dorothy had known exactly what she was doing, had been doing it intentionally and methodically for the full 40 years since she had left in her green Buick and not come back. Evelyn sat down on the floor of the library because the wing chairs were across the room and her legs had decided they were finished with the standing portion of the afternoon. She sat on the library floor with her back against a shelf and the catalog in her lap, and she thought about Dorothy at 27, driving away in a car her family dismissed as a wreck, heading north through the mountains to a house in Alderton that belonged to a branch of the Hargrove line nobody talked about. She thought about the box of books that had arrived 2 months later. For Evelyn, because you were the one who asked about the library. Dorothy had been watching. The way a person watches when they have decided that the watching matters and that the one being watched does not yet need to know. A sound came from the hall. Evelyn was on her feet before she had decided to stand. Through the library door came a woman she recognized from a photograph on Sandra's Christmas card 2 years ago, before Sandra had stopped sending Christmas cards. Sandra Cutler was 63 years old, solidly built, with the kind of careful appearance that takes significant maintenance and the expression of a woman who has already decided what she is going to say and is only waiting for the appropriate moment. Beside her was Neil Hargrove, who was 2 years younger than Sandra and had their father's thin face and their father's habit of looking at the ceiling when he was thinking, as if the ceiling contained useful information. "Evelyn," Sandra said. "Oh good, you're already here." The door was open. The door had not been open. Evelyn had closed it behind her. She said nothing about this. Sandra looked around the library. She looked at it the way a person looks at a room when they are trying to determine its approximate value and disguising the fact that this is what they are doing. Neil looked at the walls of books. He looked at the catalog on the floor where Evelyn had been sitting. He looked at Evelyn. "We just thought we'd drive up," Sandra said. "Neil had the weekend, and I said, Ev is probably up here trying to figure out what to do with all this. We should give her a hand." "That's kind," Evelyn said. "This is a lot of stuff," Neil said. He was still looking at the catalog on the floor. "Mom always said Dorothy had a lot of stuff. Old stuff. She said half of it was probably moldy." "Your mother never came here," Evelyn said. "None of you did." A small pause opened up in the room. Sandra filled it with the particular social skill of a woman who has spent 63 years managing awkward silences. "Oh, you know how it was between your mother and Dorothy. That whole business with the house in Woodstock. Ancient history, of course, but families have these things." She turned and looked at the shelves again. "Are these valuable? They look old." "They're Dorothy's books," Evelyn said. Neil picked up the catalog from the floor. He turned the first page. He looked at the column of figures. He looked at Evelyn. Evelyn crossed the room in 4 steps and took the catalog from his hands, not harshly, the way you take a fragile thing from someone who does not know it is fragile. She closed it and held it against her chest. "There are many things to go through," she said. "I'll be in touch when I have a better sense of what's here." They left 20 minutes later, the sound of their car retreating back down the gravel track through the hemlocks. Evelyn stood in the library and listened to it fade. For minutes before the silence came back completely. She spent that night in the house. There was a bedroom on the 2nd floor that Dorothy had kept habitable, a room with a high 4-poster bed and a quilt on it made from old wool suiting. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the house breathe. Old houses breathe. She had lived in old houses her whole life. The particular language of this one was unfamiliar. The way the window frames contracted in the night cold, the slow tick of a copper pipe behind the south wall, the small voice of the wind finding the loose shutter on the east side. She would learn it. She was not afraid. She noted this with some interest. She was not afraid, and she was not confused, and she was not overwhelmed. She was the way she had been on the first day of her first professional position at the Woodstock Elementary Library in 1985, when she had stood in front of 3,000 books in a system she did not yet know and felt not panic but appetite. She got up at 5 in the morning and made coffee on the old propane stove and sat at the kitchen table in the dark with the catalog in her notebook and worked until the light came through the east windows. The house itself, she had decided by that second morning, was not falling down. It was tired. There was a difference. The foundation was sound. She had walked the perimeter and looked at the sill plates with her flashlight, and the main structural timbers of a federal house built in 1823 were not going to give up on her anytime soon. The roof needed attention, water stains on the east bedroom ceiling suggesting a leak above. The plumbing was a combination of 3 different eras of pipe that would eventually require professional assessment. The heating system was ancient but functional. The kitchen was a renovation from the 1960s that had not been updated since, and fully functional in the way things from the 1960s sometimes are. Everything still worked, and nothing was comfortable. The library, by contrast, was nearly perfect, not in the sense of requiring no attention, but in the sense of having received exactly the attention it required for decades. The shelves were solid, the built-in kind mortised into the wall itself. The humidity in the room was low, the plaster walls thick, the north exposure cool. Dorothy had understood that a library is an environment before it is a collection, and she had maintained the environment with the same care she gave the books themselves. On the third wall, the one facing west, she found the section labeled simply Other. The Other section occupied the bottom 3 shelves of the west wall, 6 feet of shelving running from the floor to about waist height, and it contained items that did not fit the main collection's categories. A set of rolled architectural drawings tied with ribbon, several wooden boxes of varying sizes, a case of what appeared to be photographic slides, a collection of folders labeled in Dorothy's hand with dates ranging from 1962 to 2018. And on the bottom shelf, running the full 6 feet, a set of leather-bound volumes clearly not intended for reading. Record books, the kind with marbled end papers and cloth-covered boards that an accountant or business manager might keep across a working life. She pulled out the leftmost volume. It was labeled in Dorothy's hand on the cover, Correspondence, 1965 to 1970. She replaced it. She pulled out the rightmost. Correspondence, 2015 to 2020. She opened it to the middle. Pages filled with Dorothy's handwriting and the photocopied pages of letters received, the originals presumably filed elsewhere. She read 2 pages. Letters from institutions, auction houses, dealers, private collectors. A letter from a specialist at Sotheby's in London, dated 2016, regarding a proposed consignment. A letter from a private dealer in Geneva, dated 2017, confirming receipt of a payment. A letter from the director of a rare books collection at a university in New Haven, dated 2018, expressing interest in a manuscript Dorothy had apparently offered to them. Evelyn stood very still in the middle of the library. She thought about the way Sandra had looked at the shelves. She thought about the column of figures in the catalog. She thought about Dorothy at 27, driving north in a green Buick that her family had dismissed as a wreck and never asking for their opinion again. She went back to the full catalog that afternoon and did the arithmetic she had been putting off since the previous morning. She did it in pencil in her notebook, going entry by entry through the pages, adding the figures for every item with a value above $1,000. She was not a trained appraiser. She was not an auction specialist or a rare books dealer. She was a retired school librarian who had spent 31 years learning to assess the value of things that were harder to price than money. She added the column 3 times to make sure she had the figure right. She sat with the number for a long time. Outside the east window, the afternoon was going gold over the hemlock stand. A woodpecker was working on something in the maple near the old garden wall. The house made its quiet language of ticks and small winds. The number in her notebook sat there with the mild patience of a fact that has been true for a long time and is only now being read by the person it was always meant for. She called Ms. Crane from the kitchen that evening. She said she was going to need the name of a reputable rare books appraiser, not the kind she could find through a general internet search, the kind the auction houses used, the kind who came from Boston or New York and understood what they were looking at. Ms. Crane paused the way she had paused at their first meeting. This one was different. This one was the pause of a woman who had been waiting for this phone call. She said she might know someone. She said Dorothy had mentioned, in one of their consultations, a specialist she had worked with for many years, a man named Aldrich, based in Boston, who came highly recommended by several of the major auction houses. She said she had his card. Evelyn said she would call him in the morning. She went back to the library after supper. She walked the shelves slowly in the lamplight, the green library lamp throwing its particular warmth across the spines and the plaster walls and the plank floors dark with 190 years of use. She stopped at the west wall. She stood in front of the other section and looked at the record books on the bottom shelf. Then she looked at the west wall itself. She had spent 3 days in this library. She had walked every inch of the shelves. She knew the room now well enough that she had stopped consciously registering its dimensions and had simply begun to exist in it, the way you stop consciously registering the shape of a room you know well. Which was why it took her until that Thursday evening, standing at the west wall in the lamplight, to notice what she should have noticed on the first afternoon. She went to the east wall first and counted the depth of the room from east to west. She did it the way she had always done spatial estimation, in her own arm spans, a rough but reliable measure she had used for 31 years when deciding whether a new display would fit along a stretch of shelving. She counted. She counted again. The library, by her measurement, was 44 feet from east to west. The house, by her measurement taken from outside the previous morning when she had walked the perimeter, was 62 feet from east to west in the north wing. She stood at the west wall with her hands at her sides and looked at the shelves in front of her. Built-in shelves, mortised into the wall itself. She had thought so on the first morning. She put her hand against the plaster of the wall above the top shelf and pressed, gently. Solid. She moved along the wall to the point where the shelving ended and the plain plaster began, the section between the end of the shelves and the north wall, a blank stretch of plaster about 4 feet wide that she had registered as simply wall. She pressed the plaster. It was not plaster. It was thin painted board over a wooden frame, and when she pressed it, it flexed slightly. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. The way a door flexes when you push against it from the hinge side. She looked at the molding at the floor where the wall met the baseboard. She crouched down. The board sat flat to the floor. But at the base, in the corner closest to the shelving, she could see a line of darker wood where the board met the adjacent section of wall, a line too straight and too clean to be a plastering seam. She stood up. She went to the shelving on the adjacent section and pulled out the lowest record book on the bottom shelf, the leftmost one, the one labeled Correspondence, 1965 to 1970. She looked at the empty space where the book had been. She put her hand into the space. At the very back of the shelf, where the shelf met the back of the built-in unit, her fingers found a small brass fitting no larger than the end of her thumb. She pressed it. Nothing happened immediately. Then, after a moment that seemed longer than it was, she heard a sound. Not a click exactly. More the sound of a mechanism releasing, the kind of sound a well-maintained lock makes when it finally gives. The section of wall beside the shelving moved. Not swinging open dramatically. Just shifting, a centimeter, 2, letting in a thread of air that was cool and dry and carried a smell that was not books and not plaster and not the ordinary mineral smell of an old house settling. It carried the smell of stone, cold stone and dry air, and something underneath both of those. Something that made her think of the deep stacks room at the university library she had visited once for a professional development workshop, the part of the stacks that went underground, where the oldest items in the collection were kept in controlled conditions, and you had to sign in with a librarian before they would take you down. She stood in the library at Hargrove House with her hand on the edge of the door she had just found, and she breathed the air coming through it, and she did not move for a long time. Outside, the woodpecker had stopped. The maple stood silent in the dark. The house was very quiet around her. And behind the door in the west wall of the library, somewhere in the 18 feet between the room she was standing in and the outside wall of the house, something was waiting in the cold, in the dark that Dorothy Hargrove had spent 40 years building in secret and left to the one person in the family who had asked about the library. Evelyn pushed the door open. The passage behind it was narrow, stone-floored, low-ceilinged, running west into the dark beyond the reach of the library lamp behind her. The walls were stone, the original foundation stone of the 1823 house, cool and dry to the touch. The floor was clean. No debris. No dust accumulation. Someone had been in this passage recently and regularly. She had not brought the flashlight from the kitchen. She went back for it, crossing the library in the lamplight, and she noticed her hands were steady, which surprised her. She was 67 years old, and her hands had always been reliable indicators of her interior state. Steady hands meant something. She did not yet know what. She came back to the passage with the flashlight and stepped through the door in the west wall of Dorothy Hargrove's library, and she walked forward into the dark. She had gone perhaps 15 feet when the passage opened up. Not into a room. Not yet. But into a wider space, a landing of sorts, where the stone ceiling rose enough that she could stand fully upright. The flashlight picked up shelving. More shelving. Wooden shelves built into the stone, running along both sides of the wider passage. On the shelves were not books. Were not record books or rolled drawings or correspondence files. She moved the beams slowly. Wooden crates. Flat wooden crates of the kind she associated with museum storage, with painted stenciling on the ends that she could not immediately read in the angled light. And below the crates, on the lower shelves, trays. Shallow wooden trays with hinged lids. On one of the open trays, she could see the glint of something catching her flashlight in a way that books do not catch light, that paper does not catch light, that nothing organic catches light in quite that particular way. She stood in the widened passage with the flashlight in her hand, and the April dark around her, and the stone floor cold beneath her feet. Evelyn Marsh, who was 67 years old and retired and had come to a forgotten house in a small Vermont town to assess a property the county had valued at $43,000, understood in that moment that she was at the beginning of something very large. She also understood, with the professional instinct of a woman who had spent 31 years knowing when to handle a thing carefully and when to step back and call someone who knew more than she did, that she was not going to open a single tray or crate tonight. She turned around. She walked back through the passage to the library. She closed the door in the west wall and heard the mechanism click back into place. She put the record book back on the shelf in the exact position it had been. She turned off the library lamp. She went upstairs to the room with the four-poster bed and the wool quilt. She lay down in the dark. She called the specialist in Boston at 7 the next morning before the office opened and left a message on the voicemail. She said her name. She said she was the beneficiary of the estate of Dorothy Hargrove of Alderton, Vermont. She said she believed she had found something that required professional assessment, and that she would like him to come to the property at his earliest possible convenience. She said the matter was time-sensitive. She said she thought he should bring a colleague. She ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and her notebook and looked out the kitchen window at the hemlock stand in the early morning light. A pair of wood thrushes were working the ground beneath the trees, the same methodical working that thrushes always bring to whatever ground they are on. Thorough, unhurried. She turned to a clean page in her notebook. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote the entry number of the first item in Dorothy's catalog. She wrote the V figure beside it. She began, at the top of the column, to add. She did not rush. This was not a virtue she had worked at. It was simply how she was made. Gerald had always said she was the most patient person he had ever met, and she had always corrected him, saying that patience was the wrong word, that what he was observing was not patience but the genuine absence of urgency, which was a different thing. Patience implies struggle. The absence of urgency is simply a state of being. She had not felt urgency in 50 years of reading. She did not feel it now. The catalog took her 4 days to fully cross-reference. She worked in the library from early morning until the light from the east window went flat in the late afternoon. Then she ate whatever she had brought in the kitchen, and she went up to the room with the four-poster bed and read herself to sleep from the shelves in the bedroom, which Dorothy had stocked with the kind of books a person keeps in the room where they sleep, different from the books in the library below. Personal books. Books held together by years of reading. A paperback Middlemarch with the spine cracked in 3 places. A bird guide to the Northeast annotated in pencil in a hand Evelyn did not recognize, and therefore assumed predated Dorothy. A small collection of poetry in French that Dorothy had presumably been able to read, which was one of the 100 things about Dorothy that Evelyn understood she was still in the early stages of learning. On the second day, Neil called. He said he and Sandra had been talking, and they both felt that the family should have a better sense of what the estate contained before Evelyn made any decisions. He said he was not trying to interfere, he just wanted to make sure everything was handled properly. He said he had spoken to an estate attorney in Portland who had said that in cases where a will was contested, an independent appraisal of assets was often the most straightforward path to resolution. He said the word contested as a person says a word they have been told to introduce into the conversation. Has the will been contested, Neil? Evelyn asked. A pause. Not formally, he said. Then we have nothing to discuss, Evelyn said. She said it the way she had said it to parents who came to the library asking why she had shelved a book their child had found. Measured and clear and entirely without apology. She hung up the phone. She added 2 more pages to her notebook that evening. The column of figures was growing in a direction that had stopped surprising her and had begun to do something else entirely, something harder to name. She sat with it the way she sat with a poem she was still in the early stages of understanding, turning it over, looking for the shape of the thing beneath the immediate surface. Dorothy had never been rich in the way the family used the word rich. She had not had a visible fortune. She had not had a house that people admired, or a car worth remarking on, or a single article of clothing that Sandra would have looked at twice. What she had had was the capacity to move in circles that the rest of the family had never gained entry to, and to move in those circles quietly, without being noticed, for 40 years. The specialist in Boston, Mr. Aldrich, called back on the 3rd day of Evelyn's stay at the house. He had a voice that managed to be both precise and warm, which was not a combination she had encountered often in professional contexts, and which she suspected was something he had developed deliberately over years of working with people who were simultaneously anxious about their inheritances and afraid of appearing ignorant. He asked her 4 questions about the catalog entries she had described in her message. His questions were specific. He knew what he was asking and why. She answered all 4 directly. He said he could be in Alderton the following Thursday with a colleague who specialized in European manuscripts and another in fine art and decorative objects. He said he would need 2 days minimum to conduct an initial assessment. He said he had worked with Ms. Hargrove on several occasions over the preceding 2 decades, and that he was very sorry for the loss. Evelyn asked him how he would describe his relationship with Dorothy. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She was the most rigorous person I ever dealt with professionally. She knew the provenance of every piece she brought to me better than I did, and I have been doing this for 37 years. Whatever you find in that house, Mrs. Marsh, she meant for you to have it. She was not a woman who made decisions carelessly." Thursday was 5 days away. Evelyn closed the phone and went back to the library. The cousins arrived again on the 5th day, unannounced, a Saturday morning with a light rain coming off the mountains and the lane already softening at the edges. This time Sandra had brought a man Evelyn did not recognize, a man about Neil's age in a barn jacket who was introduced as a friend with experience in estate sales and who looked at the walls of the library with the practiced appraisal of someone whose experience lay less in books than in their resale value. He touched the spine of the Flemish manuscript without being invited to, and Evelyn was out of the wing chair and across the room before she had made the conscious decision to move. "Please don't handle the books," she said. The man in the barn jacket looked at her with the mild surprise of someone unaccustomed to being told no by a small woman in her late 60s wearing a cardigan. "We're just trying to get a sense of things," Sandra said. "For the family." "For the family," Evelyn repeated. "Which family?" Dorothy was the last of the Hargrove line. "Neil is a Hargrove on his father's side. You're a Cutler by marriage. I'm a Marsh by birth. None of us share a name with that door you came through." The rain went on against the east window. The man in the barn jacket looked at his shoes. "We're only trying to help," Neil said. "You can help," Evelyn said, "by calling before you come, and by not bringing people I haven't met into a house I have legal possession of." She walked them out herself. She stood on the front porch in the light rain and watched their car turn at the end of the lane and disappear into the hemlocks. She stood there for a long time after the sound of it had gone. Then she went back inside and down the hall, and into the library, and she stood at the west wall with her hand resting on the shelf of record books, and she thought about Dorothy at 85, sitting in this same room, knowing the house would pass to someone when she was gone, and having made a decision long before about who that someone would be. She thought about the catalog with its 412 entries. She thought about the passage in the wall. She thought about the shelves in the passage, and the crates, and the trays, and the one open tray with its glinting contents catching her flashlight like a caught breath. She had not opened a single tray. She had not moved a single crate. She had stood in the passage for perhaps 3 minutes and come back out and closed the door and replaced the book on the shelf, because she understood, with the deep professional instinct of someone who had spent 31 years telling children not to open the good books without clean hands, that some things are only ever properly opened once, and that the moment of opening deserves to be given to the right people at the right time. Mr. Aldrich was the right person. Thursday was the right time. She went back to her notebook. She went back to her column of figures. She added and she waited, and she was not afraid, and she was not impatient, and the house breathed its slow house breath around her, and the wood thrushes worked the ground beneath the hemlocks in the rain, and somewhere in the wall behind the built-in shells of the north wing's west wall, 40 years of a woman's life waited in the cold and the dark for Thursday to come. Wednesday night Evelyn did not sleep well, which was unusual for her. She lay in the 4-poster bed in Dorothy's spare room and listened to the house and ran through the catalog in her mind the way she used to run through the card catalog at the school library before the system went digital, testing herself, pulling entries at random, making sure she knew where everything was. It was a thing she had done every September for 31 years, a private inventory taken in the dark before the school year began, so that on the first morning when a child came in and asked for a book, she would already know exactly where it was and would not have to look. She had not looked at the passage since she found it. She had replaced the record book on the shelf and closed the library door behind her each evening and gone upstairs, and she had not gone back. She was not sure why, except that she understood the difference between a thing that belongs to you and a thing that belongs to the moment of its proper opening, and the passage was the second kind. She got up at 4:30 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark and went through her notebook one more time. She had a page for each of the 3 specialists Aldrich had said he would bring, one for European manuscripts, one for fine art and decorative objects, and a third, added in a follow-up call 2 days before, for financial instruments and bullion, which was a category Aldrich had not mentioned in his first call, but had mentioned in his second after what sounded like a conversation he had needed to have before calling her back. She had not asked him to elaborate on the third specialist. He had not offered to. The light came up slowly over the hemlock stand. The wood thrushes went to work in the duff beneath the trees. Evelyn sat with her coffee and her notebook and the quiet morning, and she thought about Dorothy at 27, driving away from a family that had decided she was the difficult one, heading north through the mountains in a car they had dismissed. She thought about 40 years. She thought about what a person can build in 40 years when no one is watching them and no one is expecting anything, and they have simply decided to get on with it. Mr. Aldrich's car came down the lane at 8:45, which was 15 minutes before he had said he would arrive, and which told Evelyn something about him that she filed away without comment. He was 62 or 63, compact, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of unhurried movements that belong to people who have learned not to waste motion. He was dressed in the practical way of someone who expected to spend the day on his feet in an old building. Dark wool trousers, a flannel shirt, leather-soled shoes that had been resoled twice and would be resoled again. Behind him came 2 women. The first was perhaps 50, tall, with the long, careful hands of a surgeon or a bookbinder. Introduced as Dr. Priya Mehta, Rare Manuscripts and Printed Books, currently a senior research fellow at a university he named in Cambridge but attached, he said, to several auction houses in London and New York in an advisory capacity. She looked at the front of the house as she got out of the car with the particular attention of someone accustomed to reading buildings for what they contain rather than what they look like. The second was younger, 35 or 40, with a canvas satchel over one shoulder and the slightly distracted air of a person whose mind is always partially somewhere else. Her name was Camille Voss, fine art specialist, and she had flown in from New York the previous evening on what Aldrich had described in his message as short notice, which Evelyn understood meant that Aldrich had told her something about Dorothy that made the short notice worth taking. The third specialist, the one for financial instruments, arrived 15 minutes later in a separate car, a man of about 60 named Warren Kessler, who shook Evelyn's hand briefly and said very little and carried a large black case that he held the way a physician carries a medical bag, with the ease of long habit and the awareness that what is inside has significant consequences. They stood on the porch in the April morning. The hemlock stand was dripping from the night's rain. A crow was working the garden wall at the south end of the property with the slow, deliberate attention of a crow that has found something worth investigating. Evelyn looked at the four of them. They looked at her. Nobody said anything for a moment that was slightly longer than most pauses go. "She talked about you," Aldrich said finally. "Dorothy. She mentioned you by name on more than one occasion. She said you were the librarian." "I was a librarian," Evelyn said. "She said you were the librarian. As a category." He paused. "I think I understand that better now that I've seen the property." He looked at the front of the house. "Shall we go in?" She took them directly to the library. She did not show them the other rooms first. She did not offer coffee or a tour of the grounds. She understood what they had come for, and she trusted that they understood the same thing, and she opened the library door and stood aside and let them in. Dr. Mehta stopped 2 steps inside the door. She stopped the way a person stops when they have walked into a room they were not prepared for, when the room has shown them something that their professional experience had not told them to expect at this particular address in this particular small Vermont town. She stood with her hands at her sides, and she looked at the west wall, and then the north wall, and then the south wall, and then she turned slowly all the way around and looked at each section of shelving in sequence, and her face was the face of someone solving an arithmetic problem that is coming out to a much larger number than they had estimated. "Dorothy built the shelving herself?" she said. "I believe so," Evelyn said. Based on the catalog, the earliest acquisitions predated the built-ins by about 2 years. She would have needed the shelving to house them. "Where did she learn to build shelving of this quality?" "I don't know yet," Evelyn said. "I'm still in the early stages of learning what I don't know about her." Dr. Mehta looked at Evelyn. Something in her expression shifted slightly. "The catalog," she said. "May I?" Evelyn handed it over. Dr. Mehta opened it to the first page and read for a moment, and then turned to the second page, and then she looked up at the shelf directly in front of her, and then back down at the catalog, and then she walked to the shelf and found the item by its entry number without asking how the numbering system worked, which told Evelyn that the system Dorothy had used was the same system used by the auction houses and the major institutional collections. Standard across the field. Dorothy had not invented her own language. She had simply learned the one that mattered. Evelyn watched the 3 specialists begin to move through the library. She had arranged chairs along the east wall, and she sat in one of them with her notebook, and she watched, and she did not hurry them, and she did not ask questions. She had spent 31 years watching children find their way through a library, and she knew that the most useful thing a librarian can do once the door is open is get out of the way. Kessler, the financial instruments specialist, did not look at the books. He set his black case on the long table and opened it, and took out a laptop and a portable scanner and a set of reference manuals, and he asked Evelyn where the record books were kept. She showed him the bottom shelf on the west wall. He carried the full set of them to the table, all 8 volumes, and he began with the leftmost one, Correspondence, 1965 to 1970, and he read with the kind of focused stillness that belonged to someone who was looking for a specific kind of information and finding it. After 2 hours, Aldrich came to sit beside Evelyn. He did not have the catalog with him. He had been moving through the shelves without it, pulling items and opening them and replacing them, which told her he was doing a different kind of assessment, not the item-by-item verification she had done alone, but something broader, taking the measure of the collection as a whole rather than its individual parts. He sat down in the chair beside her. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "have you had the catalog fully appraised before today?" "I added up the figures," Evelyn said. "That's all." "What did you arrive at?" She told him. He nodded. Not the nod of someone confirming a figure they had already calculated. The nod of someone making a decision about how to proceed with the next sentence. "The figures in the catalog are Dorothy's own assessments," he said. "She was, as I said on the phone, the most rigorous person I ever dealt with professionally. But her assessments were conservative. She priced things at the value she had verified through recent comparables, which in the rare books and manuscripts market means she was pricing items at their floor value, not their ceiling. The market for several of the categories represented here has moved significantly in the last 10 years. He paused. "The library alone, Mrs. Marsh. The library as you see it on these shelves, not including whatever is in the passage you mentioned in your message to me. The library alone is likely to come in somewhere between $60 and $90 million in a properly managed auction sale. The crow was still working the garden wall outside the east window. Evelyn could hear it through the glass, the purposeful tapping of a bird that has made up its mind. She looked at the shelves. She had spent 4 days in this library. She had held the Flemish manuscript in her hands. She had read Dorothy's catalog entry by entry and added the column and arrived at a number that had already seemed too large to fit inside the space she had available for large numbers. And now Aldrich had taken that number and set it to one side and told her it was the floor. "There is a passage," Evelyn said. "Yes," he said. "You mentioned it. I have been wondering when you would show us." She brought them all to the west wall. She stood in front of the shelving section with the record books. She pulled out the leftmost volume, Correspondence, 1965 to 1970, and she reached into the shelf and found the brass fitting at the back and pressed it. She heard the mechanism release. The section of wall moved. Behind her, in the library, no one spoke. She picked up the flashlight from the table where she had left it. She went through the door first. She heard them follow her one at a time. Aldrich, then Meta, then Camille Voss with her canvas satchel, then Kessler last, his footsteps deliberate on the stone floor. The passage was narrow enough that they went single file. The flashlight lit the stone walls and the stone floor and the darkness ahead, and Evelyn walked the 15 feet to the wider landing without hurrying, and she stopped when the ceiling rose and turned and held the flashlight, so the beam covered the shelving on both sides of the landing. She heard Meta make a sound. Not a word. A sound a person makes involuntarily when something they have been half expecting turns out to be real. On the shelves of the landing were the items from the catalog that Evelyn had not been able to locate on the main library shelves, the ones with catalog numbers that she had spent a full afternoon searching for and finally concluded must be stored elsewhere. She had understood, by the end of that afternoon, that elsewhere was probably the passage. But she had not been prepared for the quantity. The landing shelves held perhaps 60 additional items, each in a housing of acid-free board and archival tissue, each with a small label in Dorothy's hand giving the catalog entry number and the date of acquisition. Meta was already crouching at the lower shelves with her own flashlight out. Aldrich stood beside her, very still. "Dorothy," he said, not as an exclamation, as a statement. "The way you say someone's name when they have done exactly what you should have expected them to do, and the expectation and the reality have finally met." "The passage continues," Evelyn said. Aldrich looked up. His flashlight followed hers to the far end of the landing, where the stone floor gave way to a staircase descending into the dark below the level of the house's foundation. She had not gone down the stairs on the night she found the passage. She had stood at the top of them and shone her flashlight into the dark below and seen the bottom step and nothing beyond it, and she had come back out and closed the door and gone upstairs to bed. They went down together. 14 steps, she counted, each one cut from the same granite as the passage walls, worn at the center in the way of stairs that have carried weight for a very long time. At the bottom was another passage, lower ceilinged than the one above, running south through the bedrock beneath the north wing of the house. The air here was cooler, drier, the kind of controlled stillness that a wine cellar or a museum storage room has when it has been properly maintained for decades. The passage ended at a door. Not a hidden door this time, just a door, solid pine planking, hung on iron hinges, with a padlock of the same brass make as the one in the passage above. Evelyn had the key from the ring Miss Crane had given her. She had not known until this moment which lock it was for. She put the key in the padlock and turned it, and pushed the door open. The first room beyond the door was large, perhaps 40 feet by 30, with a ceiling that rose to 10 feet, the full height of the house's ground floor above. The walls were stone, the same granite of the cellar, but lined on 3 sides with wooden panels that had been fitted with care, the joints tight and even. The fourth wall was bare stone, and from it ran 2 iron pipe fittings that Evelyn recognized after a moment as a dehumidification system, the simple mechanical kind that a person who understood what moisture does to old things would have installed and maintained without drama. On the wooden panels hung paintings, not hung the way paintings hang in a house, where they are arranged to complement a room. Hung the way paintings are stored in an institution, close together, organized by size, with lighting that served the paintings rather than the room. Dorothy had installed picture lights along the top of the wooden panels, each one on a separate switch on a panel by the door. Evelyn found the panel and turned them on one row at a time. Camille Voss had not made a sound in the passage. She made one now. She walked to the nearest painting before Evelyn had finished with the switches, and she stood in front of it with her flashlight supplementing the picture light above, and she said in the voice of someone speaking from a great distance, "This is a Bonnard." "I know," Evelyn said. She had read the catalog entry 3 days ago. Pierre Bonnard, oil on canvas, 1928, interior with woman reading, purchased Paris, 1971. V3. 2M, even by Dorothy's conservative standards. Voss was already moving to the next painting. "This is a Vuillard." She stopped. She looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Marsh, where did your aunt acquire a Vuillard?" "Paris, 1969, Evelyn said. "According to the catalog." Voss looked back at the painting. She looked at it for a long time. "She bought it in 1969. "Yes." "At 1969 prices." "I assume so." Voss stood in the cellar room under the picture lights and looked at the row of paintings and did the kind of silent arithmetic that art specialists do when they have found themselves in a room that represents a significant revision to their morning. There were 31 paintings on the 3-paneled walls. Evelyn knew this from the catalog. She had counted them. She had read the entries. Bonnard. Vuillard. A small early Matisse that Dorothy had bought at an estate sale in the south of France in 1974 for what the catalog noted was a figure that had made the estate lawyer nervous because he thought it was too high. A pair of drawings by Egon Schiele that had come from a dealer in Vienna in 1977. 3 paintings by an American artist named Milton Avery that Dorothy had been buying since 1966, when Avery had been alive and his prices had been, as the catalog noted in Dorothy's dry shorthand, accessible. Avery had died in 1965. His prices had not remained accessible. In the center of the room, on a long wooden table built from the same pine as the door, stood a series of flat storage boxes, each one labeled in Dorothy's hand. Evelyn had not opened them on the night she found the passage. She opened them now, lifting each lid in sequence while Aldrich watched from the doorway. Prints. Drawings. Works on paper that Dorothy had acquired over 40 years from auction sales and dealers, and in at least 3 cases directly from artists she had known, whose names were written in the catalog in the same undemonstrative hand as all the other entries, as if buying a drawing directly from a working artist in 1963 were no different from buying a library book. Kessler had not come into the art room. He had stopped on the landing above, and Evelyn had heard him open his case. She heard him now, somewhere above her on the stairs, speaking quietly on his phone in the way of a man who has found what he was looking for and is reporting its coordinates to someone who was waiting for the call. There was a second door at the far end of the art room. This one was iron, set into the stone of the back wall. It had no handle, only a combination dial of the kind that bank vaults used in the middle of the last century, a heavy steel dial with numbers engraved around its face in the even spacing of something made to last 100 years. Beside the dial, at shoulder height, was a small brass plate engraved with 2 words in the same plain capital letters as the stenciling on the storage crates upstairs. For Evelyn. She stood in front of it for a long time. Aldrich came to stand beside her. He looked at the plate. He looked at the dial. He looked at Evelyn. "Do you know the combination?" he asked. She thought about Dorothy's letters. She thought about the boxes of books arriving without warning across a lifetime. She thought about the note. "For Evelyn, because you are the one who asked about the library." She thought about the date on the first catalog entry. She thought about the date on the first entry of the joint savings account at the bank, the first entry Dorothy had ever made in the name she had chosen for her secret life. She thought about the date of her own birth. She stepped forward. She turned the dial to the right. She dialed in the numbers of the month and day and year of her birthday in February of 1957. She heard the mechanism move through its sequence. On the last number, the iron door released. She opened it. The vault was smaller than the art room, no more than 15 feet by 15, with a stone ceiling and a floor of poured concrete that was decades old but perfectly sound. The air inside was different from the air in the passage and the art room, cooler by several degrees, with a faint mineral quality that was not stone and not paper and not cloth, but the particular smell of refined metal stored in a sealed room for a very long time. Along the left wall, on steel shelving that had been bolted to the stone, were the bars. Each one was the standard weight she recognized from the catalog description, roughly 27 pounds of refined gold in a brick approximately 7 inches long, each stamped with a hallmark she could not immediately read in the vault's dim light. There were 4 shelves, 40 bars per shelf, 160 bars in total. She had read this entry in the catalog 3 days ago and arrived at a figure and sat with it and not known quite where to put it. Along the right wall, in archival boxes identical to those used for the manuscripts upstairs, were the financial documents. Bearer bonds, the catalog said, issued by 3 different Swiss institutions across a period running from 1968 to 1991. Alongside the bonds, in a separate series of boxes, were the certificates for a portfolio of equity holdings managed through a private bank in Geneva, whose name appeared in Dorothy's correspondence files under a simple abbreviation that Evelyn had read without initially understanding what she was reading. At the back of the vault, on a small table of the same pine as everything Dorothy had built in this house, was a wooden box. The same size and shape as the box in the library above, the one with the carved motif on the lid. This one had no carving. This one was plain and unfinished, and had been placed on the table with the care of something left in a specific position for a specific person defined in a specific order. Evelyn opened it. Inside, on a folded square of cream linen, was a letter. A long letter, many pages, in Dorothy's handwriting. Not the catalog shorthand. Not the correspondence formal register she had used in the letters to Sotheby's and the dealer in Geneva. Her own voice. The one from the margins of the Dickinson poems. The one from the note in the box of books when Evelyn was 11 years old. She read it standing in the vault doorway with Aldrich behind her and the gold on the shelves to her left, and Kessler's voice still faintly audible through 2 stone walls and a stone ceiling above. The letter began without preamble, which was exactly how Dorothy had always begun. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then you found the brass fitting in the shelf, and you figured out the combination, and you are standing in a room that I have been thinking about you standing in for a very long time. I want you to know how I built it. Not the money part. The money part is straightforward, and Kessler will explain it to you. What I want to tell you is the part that came before the money. In 1965, I was 27 years old, and your father had just told me that the family house in Woodstock was going to be sold to pay for Calvin's medical school, and my share of the proceeds was going to be $32,000. He said this as if he were doing me a favor. He said he was settling my portion ahead of the sale, so I could get on with my life. He said this in the kitchen of that house on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and then he drove away, and I stood on the porch and watched his car go, and I understood something I had been trying not to understand for about 15 years. I was the inconvenient one. I had been the inconvenient one since I was old enough to have opinions that disagreed with the family's. What your father was telling me, in the language that families use when they do not want to say the true thing directly, was that I had been bought out, that my share of the family had been converted to a check, and that the check was the end of the matter. I drove north with $32,000 in a green Buick that everyone else in the family thought was unreliable, and I found this house, and I paid $6,000 for it at a tax sale, and I kept the rest. The first thing I bought with the remaining $26,000 was the Flemish manuscript. It was 1965. The rare manuscripts market was not what it became. My $32,965 were worth considerably more in purchasing power than you might assume. I had read about the manuscript in a catalog from a small auction house in Boston that had been sending me their listings since I borrowed their reading room the summer I was 19, and they decided I was serious enough to keep on the mailing list. I was serious. That was the thing they had all missed. I spent the next 5 years learning. Not formally. I had no formal education in this. I spent them the way I had always learned anything, which was by reading everything written on the subject and then finding the people who knew more than the books and sitting with them until they decided to talk. I found Aldrich in 1971. He was 32 and working for a small house in Boston, and he was, I could see immediately, the most rigorous person in the room at every sale he attended. We worked together for 50 years. He will be with you today. He will tell you what things are worth. Trust him absolutely. I bought what I understood. I was a librarian's daughter and a librarian's niece and a reader since before I had language for what reading was. I understood books. I understood what made a book a thing of value beyond its contents. And then I started looking at the images in the books, and I understood that the people who had made those images had also made other things, and I started learning what those other things were worth and where they could be found. By 1985, the collection had grown past the library. I built the passage in 1986. I did not hire anyone. I read about the original construction of the house, and I found the original cellar plans at the County Historical Society, and I understood that the cellar beneath the north and west wings had been sealed in 1901 during a renovation, and that the rooms beneath were still there, simply walled off, accessible from the inside if you knew where to look. I knew where to look. I looked. The gold I began buying in 1973, when the gold standard was abandoned and the price was still low enough that a woman with a 30-year accumulation of auction profits and good judgment could buy meaningfully without attracting attention. I continued buying in moderate amounts across the following 4 decades. The bonds came from the Geneva Bank. I opened the account there in 1969, on the same trip to Europe where I bought the Vuillard, because I had enough money by then to need a bank that did not require me to explain where it had come from to anyone at a family dinner. I did not tell anyone because I knew what telling does. I had watched your father tell people things for 60 years. I had watched the things he told become the things that organized the family's behavior. And I had watched the family's behavior become a system that served the people in the center of it and extracted from the people at the edges. I was at the edge. You were going to be at the edge. I did not want what I was building to be organized by that system. I put your name on the vault before you were born. Not legally. I could not do that at the time. But I put it on the plate outside the door in 1982, the February you came into the world, because I had decided before you were born that you were the one who would know what to do with it. I do not know how I knew. I knew. What I want you to do with it is whatever you want. I have no instructions. I have only one piece of information I want you to have, which is that the collection is worth considerably more than the figures in the catalog. I was conservative in my assessments, intentionally. The true figure will surprise you. Let Aldrich tell you when he has finished his full assessment. Sit down when he tells you. You asked about the library when you were 11. No one else ever asked. Your mother asked about the dining room furniture. Your cousins asked where the bathroom was. You walked into the library at this house the one time I brought you here as a child, and you stood very still in the middle of it, and you said, "Aunt Dorothy, have you read all of these?" And I said, "Most of them." And you said, "Which ones haven't you read yet?" And I said, "The ones on the top shelf on the left side of the north wall." And you said, "Why haven't you read those?" And I said, "Because I am saving them." And you said, "For what?" And I said, "For when I have more time." And you were quiet for a moment, and then you said, "That is a good reason." You were 8 years old. I knew then. The library is yours. The passage is yours. The rooms below are yours. All of it, everything in every box and on every shelf and behind every door I built in this house, is yours. I built it one piece at a time across 40 years, one purchase at a time, one careful decision at a time, and I built it for you because you were the one who understood that some things are worth saving for when there is more time. There is more time now, Evelyn. It is yours. With everything I have and everything I built with it. Your Aunt Dorothy. She folded the letter on its original creases. She pressed it against her chest with the flat of her hand, the way you hold something warm against you when the room around you is cold. She stood in the doorway of the iron vault in the cellar of a house that had been assessed at $43,000, and she felt the weight of 40 years of one woman's careful, invisible life settle around her like a coat. Behind her, in the art room, Voss was talking quietly on her phone. Aldrich had come back up the stone staircase and was in the landing, going through the archival boxes on the shelves with Dr. Mehta, their voices low and technical, the conversation of two people who have entered a professional situation neither of them had fully prepared for. Kessler appeared at the vault door. He looked at the shelves of gold with the expression of a man confirming something he had already estimated from other evidence. He looked at Evelyn. "The bond certificates," he said. "May I take them upstairs where the light is better?" "Yes," she said. She stepped aside. He went to the right wall, and he opened the first archival box with the care of a surgeon, and he lifted the first certificate and held it up to the flashlight beam, and he read for a moment, and then he put it back and opened the second box and did the same thing, and he worked through all 11 boxes this way, methodically, without hurrying. And when he was done, he collected all 11 boxes in his arms, and he carried them up the stairs to the landing. That afternoon, they worked in the library. Aldrich and Mehta at the long table under the east window. Voss on the floor with photographs she had taken in the cellar art room spread around her in a loose arc. Kessler at the smaller table near the south wall with the bond certificates and his laptop and his reference manuals open in a stack beside him. Evelyn in the wing chair by the fireplace with Dorothy's letter folded in her coat pocket and her notebook open on her knee. Nobody asked her for anything. Nobody looked to her for direction. She had opened the door and shown them the rooms and stood aside, and they had taken it from there. And she understood that this was the correct sequence and that her part in the sequence was, for now, to sit in the chair and wait and let her hands rest in her lap. Her hands were steady. She had noted this in the vault, and she noted it again now. She thought about Dorothy writing, "Sit down when he tells you." She looked at the wing chair she was already sitting in. She thought that Dorothy would have found this satisfactory. The cousins called at 2 in the afternoon. Sandra, not Neil. Sandra's voice had lost the practiced warmth of the previous call. What remained was the thing underneath the warmth, which was a particular kind of urgency that Evelyn recognized from the school. Library's most difficult parents. The ones who arrived knowing what they wanted and had decided before arriving that any response other than yes was going to be treated as an obstruction. She said she had spoken to an attorney. She said the attorney had told her that in cases where a deceased had made substantial gifts of assets before death, without the knowledge of immediate family, there were grounds for a challenge based on undue influence. She said she wanted Evelyn to know that the family was not trying to be adversarial. They just wanted to make sure everything was handled fairly. Evelyn sat in the wing chair with the phone pressed to her ear and looked at Aldrich at the long table 12 feet away. He glanced up. He had heard enough of the call's tone to understand its nature. He looked back down at the catalog. Sandra, Evelyn said. Dorothy was the last of the Hargrove line. The property came to her through her great-uncle's estate in 1963, before you or Neil were born, when your parents were newly married and had no claim on it. The will has been assessed by 2 separate attorneys and found legally sound. Dorothy was in full possession of her faculties at the time it was written, a fact attested to by her physician, her attorney, and the county notary who witnessed the signing. There is no ground for a challenge based on undue influence because I have not influenced anything. I was not informed of the bequest until after Dorothy's death. I have documentation for all of this. A silence opened up on the line. Into it came the faint sound of Sandra's breathing, and, behind that, the sound of a second voice, Neil's voice, speaking to someone on a different phone in the background. I would like to see the property, Sandra said. No, Evelyn said. Evelyn. No, Evelyn said again. She said it the way she had said it in the library 2 days before. The way she had said it for 31 years to parents and administrators and school board members who had arrived with their minds made up. Measured. Clear. Without apology. Without the slight softening that signals a possibility of reconsideration. She ended the call. She put the phone on the arm of the wing chair. She looked at the fire she had built that morning in the fireplace, which had gone to coals now, but was still putting out heat. She looked at the shelves. She thought about Dorothy in 1965, $32,000, and a green Buick, heading north through the October Mountains to a tax sale house in Alderton. She thought Dorothy would have said no in exactly that same way. The first assessment numbers came at 5 o'clock. Aldrich set a sheet of paper on the arm of her chair without ceremony, the way a colleague sets something down rather than the way a professional delivers a report to a client. She picked it up. 3 columns. The library, the cellar rooms, the financial instruments, and bullion. Each column had a subtotal at the bottom. She read the subtotals. She read each line of the library column first, the way she always read a document, from the beginning, because she had found over a long life that people who skip to the bottom of a document often miss the thing that explains why the bottom number is what it is. She read the library column. She read the cellar column. She read the financial column. Then she read the 3 subtotals at the bottom. Then she added them. She sat in the wing chair with the paper in both hands. Outside the east window the April light was going, the hemlock stand going dark from the bottom up. Kessler was packing his reference manuals into his case. Meta was at the catalog, making notes in the margin in pencil, small precise marks that she would be able to read back in 6 months' time. Voss was on the phone in the doorway of the library, her voice low, her back to the room. Evelyn looked at the bottom of the column. She sat down. She had already been sitting. She understood what Dorothy had meant. The 3 subtotals were preliminary figures, Aldrich said, from the chair he had pulled alongside hers. His voice as measured as it had been on the phone 2 weeks before, calibrated with long practice for the particular register required when numbers this size needed to be spoken aloud to a person who has not heard them said about anything they owned before. The library's catalog value adjusted for current market conditions was between $85 and $100 million. He would need 6 to 8 weeks of formal assessment for a firm number. The cellar art room, preliminary, based on Voss's initial identifications against current auction comparables, between 150 and 200 million. The financial instruments and bullion, Kessler's preliminary figure, approximately $138 million at current gold prices and bond valuations, pending full audit of the Geneva accounts. He stopped. He let her sit with the 3 figures. She looked at the column she had written in her own hand at the bottom of the sheet, the 3 subtotals added together, the number that she and Dorothy, and perhaps only one other person in the world, who was now sitting beside her in the wing chair, knew. $423 million, preliminary, subject to full assessment. She put the paper on her knee. She looked at the fire. She looked at the shelves. She looked at the catalog on the long table with its 412 entries in Dorothy's handwriting and the V figures in the right-hand column that had been understated by intention for 40 years. She thought about Dorothy at 27, buying a Flemish manuscript in 1965 with money her family had used to tell her she was the inconvenient one. She thought about Dorothy at 60, building the passage with her own hands rather than hiring someone. She thought about Dorothy at 93, going down the stone staircase one last time to leave a letter on a pine table inside an iron vault, and then coming back up and closing the door and closing the passage and replacing the record book on the shelf, and going upstairs to the room with the 4-poster bed and the wool quilt and lying down to wait for the end that was coming. She thought about what it means to spend 40 years building something in complete secret, not from shame, not from fear, but from clarity about who would know what to do with it and who would not. Outside in the lane, the headlights of a car swept past the library window. Then a second pair of headlights. Both cars stopped at the edge of the clearing. She heard doors open. Aldrich heard it too. He looked toward the window. He looked at Evelyn. Sandra and Neil? Evelyn said. They drove up from Burlington. What would you like to do? She put the paper with the column of figures into the inside pocket of her cardigan. She stood up from the wing chair. She looked at the shelves once more, and then at the window, and then she went to the door of the library, and she called to Kessler, who was in the hall. Mr. Kessler, she said, I need you to stay in the library tonight. You and Dr. Mehta and Ms. Voss. I will sleep here as well. Kessler looked at her. He did not ask why. He was the kind of person who understood why without being told. Of course, he said. There are 4 bedrooms on the 2nd floor, Evelyn said. The linens in the 3rd bedroom are clean. The propane stove works. There is food enough for 4 in the kitchen. Help yourselves to whatever you find. She looked at Aldrich. I am going to go outside and have a conversation. Aldrich looked at her with the expression he had worn in the library that morning when she had handed him the catalog without being asked. Something between assessment and recognition. Would you like company? He said. No, she said. Thank you. I've been managing the cousins since I was 11 years old. She put on her coat. She put her hand into the inside pocket and felt the paper with the column of figures. She took her flashlight from the hall table. She opened the front door of Hargrove House, and she walked out into the April dark where her cousin Sandra was standing at the top of the porch steps with her phone in her hand, and Neil was behind her on the stone path, and the hemlocks were black against the darker black of the sky, and the first stars were up over the ridgeline. She stood on the porch with the door closed behind her and looked at them. They looked at her. The crow was not working the garden wall at this hour. The thrushes had gone to ground. The only sound in the clearing was the wind moving through the upper branches of the hemlocks with the slow patience of wind that has been moving through those trees since before anyone who was currently standing in this clearing was born. Sandra opened her mouth. Evelyn had been waiting her whole adult life to say the next sentence, although she had not known until this moment that this was the sentence she had been waiting for. She said it. She said it quietly, without heat, without the particular edge that people put into sentences they have been saving up. She said it the way Dorothy would have said it, with the directness of someone who has no remaining interest in managing other people's feelings about an accomplished fact. She said, Dorothy spent 40 years making sure this house and everything in it was mine. She did it carefully, and she did it legally, and she did it with the full understanding of what your intentions would be when you found out. She knew you would come. She counted on the fact that I would be here when you did. I am here. Nothing in this house is yours. Nothing in this house is going to become yours. You can call any attorney you like. You can file whatever papers your attorney recommends. And at the end of that process, which will take longer and cost more than you are prepared for, you will receive the same answer you are receiving tonight. Neil said, Evelyn, be reasonable. I am being reasonable, she said. Reasonable is exactly what I am being. She turned around. She opened the front door and went back inside and closed it behind her. She locked it, which she had not done on any of the previous nights. She stood in the dark front hall with her hand on the door for a moment, feeling the solid weight of the pine planking under her palm. From the library came the quiet sound of Aldrich's voice and Metta's voice in conversation. From the kitchen came the sound of Kessler filling the kettle at the sink. From outside on the porch came the sound of nothing at all, which told her that Sandra and Neil were still standing there, which was their right, and which would not change anything. She walked to the library. She sat back down in the wing chair. She put the paper with the column of figures on the arm of the chair. She thought about Dorothy at 85 sitting in this same chair on an October afternoon 9 years ago, telling Evelyn she was saving the books on the top shelf for when she had more time. She thought about the journal entry Dorothy had written in 1982, the February Evelyn was born, describing the morning she had walked to the iron door and etched 2 words on a brass plate. For Evelyn. She was 67 years old. She was a retired librarian. She had $423 million in gold and art and manuscripts and bonds sitting in the rooms below the house she was sitting in, and the preliminary assessment was not yet complete, and the final figure would be higher. She picked up her notebook. She opened it to a clean page. She wrote the date at the top. She began to make a list of the things she wanted to do. It was a long list. She was a long way from the end of it when Aldrich came back into the library at 9 o'clock and told her that Sandra and Neil's cars had gone from the lane. She did not look up from the notebook. Good, she said. Sit down. I want to ask you something about the Matisse. The Matisse had been acquired at a private estate sale in the Var region of southern France in the spring of 1974. Dorothy had not been first on the list to view it. She had been third, behind a dealer from Paris and a collector from Lyon who had both withdrawn after the opening figure, which the estate's administrator had set at a number that reflected a family's reluctance rather than a market assessment. Dorothy had paid it. She had wired the money from the Geneva bank on a Tuesday and taken the train down from Paris on a Thursday and carried the painting back to Vermont in a flat shipping case she had had made for it in Nice by a framer she had used twice before. Aldrich knew the provenance. He had seen the documentation in the vault that afternoon, the bill of sale, the shipping records, the import certificate. Dorothy had filed with a precision that suggested she had understood from the beginning that provenance documentation was the thing that would matter most when the time came. He sat in the wing chair beside Evelyn and told her what he knew, and then he told her the thing she had not known, which was that the family from whom Dorothy had bought the painting had been in correspondence with her for several years before the sale. The father had been a small-scale collector in Nice, a doctor who had bought the Matisse directly from the artist in 1943 and had kept it through the war and through the post-war years and into his old age with the careful domesticity of a man who loved a thing without needing to publicize the fact. When he died in 1973, his daughter had written to a list of people her father had corresponded with over the years, informing them of the estate and the sale. Dorothy had been on that list because Dorothy and the doctor had exchanged letters about book conservation for 11 years, a correspondence that lived in one of the volumes on the west wall under Correspondence, 1962 to 1970, which Evelyn had not yet read. The daughter had wanted the painting to go to someone who would keep it whole. The Paris dealer had made clear he intended to sell. The Lyon collector had made the same implication. Dorothy had written the daughter a letter, which Aldrich had not read, but which was presumably in the correspondence files, and the daughter had called her, and they had spoken for 40 minutes. And on the following Tuesday Dorothy had wired the money. She told me once, Aldrich said, that she never bought anything she did not intend to keep. She said collectors who buy as speculation are a different profession. She said she was not in that profession. Evelyn looked at the wall of books. She thought about keeping. She thought about what it means to be a keeper, to understand that certain things have to be held by someone or they come apart, and to decide to be that person without announcing it, and without requiring the thing you are holding to acknowledge the fact that you are holding it. She had been a keeper her whole life. She had kept the school library through 3 rounds of budget cuts that had eliminated the library at every other elementary school in the district. She had kept Gerald's bird feeder going for 16 months. She had kept, in a box under the bed in the Maple Street house, every letter Dorothy had ever sent her. She thought about 40 years of a woman keeping things in a hidden room. The assessment, Evelyn said. How long? 6 weeks, Aldrich said. Possibly 8. Meta will need to bring in 2 additional specialists for the manuscript collection. Voss will want to conduct her own independent research on 3 or 4 of the paintings before she puts her name on a number. Kessler can have the financial instruments audited within 2 weeks. The Geneva Bank will cooperate once we make formal contact. And the gold? The gold is simple, Aldrich said. The gold is what it is. The weight and the hallmark and the current market price. It does not require a specialist. She went to bed at 11. Kessler was in the 3rd bedroom, Meta in the 4th. Voss had arranged a sleeping bag on the library floor, which she had apparently done before in similar circumstances, because she produced it from the canvas satchel with the ease of someone reaching for a familiar thing. Aldrich drove back to his hotel in Woodstock. The night was clear and cold, the mountain cold that April still produces after dark in Vermont, and Evelyn lay on her back in Dorothy's bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the paper in her coat pocket and the list she had started in her notebook before Aldrich told her the cousins had gone. She was not afraid, and she was not confused. She was the way she had been at the beginning of every September for 31 years, standing in front of a library she knew perfectly well, feeling the appetite that comes before the work of a new year. In the morning she called Mara. She did not tell Mara the number. She had decided, lying on her back in the dark at 2 in the morning, that the number was not the first thing Mara needed to hear. The first thing Mara needed to hear was the same thing Evelyn had needed to hear, that Dorothy had been watching, and that what Dorothy had seen was a specific and particular person and not a general category of family. She told Mara about the library. She told her about the catalog. She told her about the passage and the staircase and the art room and the vault and the iron door with the plate that said for Evelyn. She told her about the letter. Mara was quiet on the phone for a long time. Longer than Mara was usually quiet. "Mom," she said finally. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Evelyn said. "Better than fine. What are you going to do?" "I am going to make a list," Evelyn said. "I have started." Mara came up on the following Saturday in her own car, without her husband, without her children, alone, which told Evelyn that she understood the visit required a version of her attention she could not bring with other people in the car. She drove up the lane in the late morning with the rain from the night before still on the hemlocks and the mud in the lane still soft, and she parked beside Evelyn's car, and she got out, and she looked at the front of Hargrove house, and she looked at her mother standing on the porch. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "Dorothy always bought more than she appeared to have," Evelyn said. She took Mara through the house in the same order she had taken Aldrich's team, which was the library first and everything else after, because the library was the part that explained the rest. Mara walked the shelves the way Evelyn had walked them, slowly, reading the spines, occasionally pulling something out and looking at it and putting it back. She was not a rare book specialist. She was a hospital administrator who had grown up in a house full of books because her mother was a librarian, and she looked at these shelves the way a person looks at things they have always understood without being able to articulate how they understand them. At the west wall, she stopped. She looked at the section where the record books sat on the bottom shelf. She looked at the blank panel of wall beside it. She looked at Evelyn. "The door is here," she said. "The fitting is at the back of the shelf," Evelyn said. "Behind the leftmost volume." Mara reached into the shelf without being told which shelf and found the fitting and pressed it. She had done the same arithmetic Evelyn had done, measured the room against the house, noticed the discrepancy. She had done it in her first 20 minutes in the library. She was her mother's daughter. The mechanism released. The door moved. Mara went through it first this time, and Evelyn followed her, and they walked through the passage to the landing and down the stairs and through the door of the art room, and Mara stood in the center of the art room under the picture lights and looked at the 31 paintings on the paneled walls, and she did not say anything for a very long time. Then she said, "I am going to need you to explain to me how my great-aunt bought a Bonnard in 1971. "In Paris," Evelyn said. "At an auction." She had been on the mailing list for the auction house since 1967. Mara turned slowly in the center of the room. She looked at each painting in sequence, the same slow clockwise turn Evelyn had done on the day Aldrich opened the picture lights. Then she stopped, facing the far wall, and she stood very still. "The iron door," she said. "Yes." "What's inside?" Evelyn told her. She told her about the gold and the bonds and the Geneva account and Kessler's preliminary figures. She told her the number. She said it the way Aldrich had said it to her, in the measured register of someone who has learned that large numbers need to be given room to settle before the next sentence is spoken. Mara sat down on the floor of the art room. She sat down in the same way Evelyn had sat down on the library floor 2 weeks before, not in distress, not overcome, but because the legs had reached a decision independent of the mind. She sat on the floor in her coat, and she looked at the bonheur on the wall in front of her, a woman reading by a window, the light in the painting the particular honeyed light of the south of France in the afternoon. "She built all of this," Mara said. "She built all of it," Evelyn said. "Alone. Alone." Mara looked at the bonheur for another moment. Then she said, "I should have come here when you were a child, when she was still alive." "You were born after the last time I came here," Evelyn said. "Dorothy and I corresponded after that. She sent books." "She sent you books?" Mara said. Not as a question, as a statement of something she was recording. "She sent you a book," Evelyn said. "When you were born. I didn't know you'd remember." Mara looked at her mother. "The one about the birds," she said. "The field guide with the hand-drawn plates. I still have it." Evelyn had not known this. She sat down on the floor beside her daughter, and they looked at the woman reading by the window together, the two of them on the floor of a hidden room beneath a forgotten house in a small Vermont town, and the April light that was not in the painting but was coming through the door from the passage above lay across the concrete floor between them. She did not look at her notebook during the 6 weeks that followed. She did not need to. The list she had started was clear enough in her mind that writing it down felt redundant, the way writing down the name of a book feels redundant when you have already memorized the call number. The specialists came and went. Meta returned twice with 2 additional colleagues, a woman from the Bodleian in Oxford who spent 4 days in the library and the landing with her own equipment and left with a preliminary assessment report that ran to 40 pages. Voss conducted her independent research on 4 paintings and came back at the end of the 3rd week with a revision upward on the Sheila drawings, which had been acquired before the market for Sheila's work had fully understood what it was looking at. Kessler's audit of the Geneva accounts took 11 days and produced a figure slightly higher than his preliminary estimate, because Dorothy had maintained the accounts with a discipline that meant compound growth had been working in her favor for longer than anyone had calculated. The cousin's attorney sent a letter in the 3rd week. It was a measured letter, which told Evelyn that the attorney was a careful person who had read the documentation before committing to a position. The letter raised 3 questions about the will's execution and requested copies of the documentation. Evelyn forwarded the letter to Ms. Crane in Rutland, and Ms. Crane responded within 48 hours with copies of everything the attorney had requested, plus 3 additional documents the attorney had not requested but would need. Ms. Crane's cover note to Evelyn said, simply, "This will not proceed. The documentation is thorough." Dorothy was unusually thorough. The attorney's office called 2 weeks later and said they had reviewed the materials and did not feel there were sufficient grounds to proceed. Neil called Evelyn the same afternoon. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings. He said family was complicated. He said if there was ever anything he could do. "There isn't," Evelyn said. She said it without heat and without satisfaction. It was simply the accurate answer. She had a conversation she had not expected with Sandra a week after Neil's call. Sandra drove up to Alderton alone this time, on a Wednesday morning, and she called ahead, which she had not done on either of the previous visits. She parked on the lane and knocked on the front door and waited. Evelyn opened the door. They looked at each other on the porch. Sandra was holding a casserole dish covered with a towel the way women in small towns have held casserole dishes when arriving at difficult conversations for as long as anyone can remember, as if the casserole constitutes a kind of credential. "I made too much," Sandra said. Evelyn stepped aside. Sandra came in. They sat at the kitchen table with the casserole between them, and Evelyn made coffee, and Sandra did not say anything for a while, and Evelyn did not fill the silence, because she had learned a long time ago that the most useful thing you can do with a silence that belongs to someone else is leave it alone. My mother and your mother talked about Dorothy once, Sandra said finally. When I was about 12, I was doing homework at the kitchen table, and they were talking about Dorothy, and I heard my mother say, Dorothy always thought she was better than the rest of us. And your mother said, I don't think that's it. And my mother said, then what is it? And your mother said, I think Dorothy just stopped caring what we thought. She looked at the casserole dish. I thought about that for years. I couldn't figure out which one of them was right. Evelyn looked at her coffee cup. I think they were both partly right, Evelyn said. Dorothy did think she was better at certain things. Building things. Keeping things. Seeing what was worth keeping. She was right about that. And she also stopped caring what the family thought, which is a different thing from thinking you're better. It's more like deciding that other people's opinions of your choices are not a relevant factor in making them. Sandra sat with this for a moment. She was like that at 20, she said. According to my mother. Even before she drove away. Yes, Evelyn said. I think she probably was. Sandra ate a bowl of the casserole at Evelyn's kitchen table. She did not ask about the collection or the number or the legal situation. She asked about Mara, whether she was coming up often. She asked about the house, whether Evelyn was going to keep it. She asked whether Evelyn had found anyone to look at the roof. She said her nephew did roofing work in the area and was reliable, and she could give Evelyn his number if she wanted it. Evelyn wrote the number down. She called the nephew on the following Monday. He came the next week, a quiet man of about 35 with the unhurried confidence of someone who has been working on old roofs long enough to know exactly what he is looking at. And he walked the full perimeter of the roof line and came back down and gave Evelyn a figure that was less than she had expected and said he could start in 2 weeks if the weather held. She said that would suit her fine. The full assessment report from Aldrich's team arrived on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks and 2 days after his first visit, delivered by courier in a sealed envelope with a handwritten note from Aldrich on top. The note was 3 sentences. It said, Dorothy's numbers were, in every case, conservative. The final figure reflects a market for each category that has moved substantially since her most recent entries. I have been doing this work for 37 years, and this is the most rigorous private collection I have ever assessed. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and opened the report. She read it the way she read every document, from the first page to the last, before she looked at the final number. The manuscript and printed books collection, $92 million, adjusted to current auction market comparables, based on 17 confirmed comparables from sales in the past 3 years. The art collection, $184 million, with a note from Voss that the Sheila drawings alone had moved the figure $14 million above Aldrich's preliminary estimate, and that 3 additional paintings had been identified as significant during her independent research, 2 of which had provenances that would generate substantial auction interest. The financial instruments and bullion, $141 million, reflecting gold price movement during the assessment period and a revised upward estimate of the Geneva account balance following full audit. She looked at the total at the bottom of the final page. $417 million. She put the report down on the table. She looked out the kitchen window at the hemlock stand. The wood thrushes were at it again in the duff beneath the trees. She thought about Dorothy writing. Let Aldrich tell you when he has finished. Sit down when he tells you. She was already sitting down. She thought Dorothy would have found this satisfactory a second time. She picked up the phone and called Aldrich. I've read it, she said. And, he said. It's thorough, she said. It's exactly what I expected from you. A pause on the line. She could hear him at his desk in Boston, the particular quality of a quiet office in the morning. What do you want to do with it, Evelyn? He had started using her first name sometime in the 3rd week. She had noticed and not corrected it because it was the right register for what they had become, which was something between colleagues and the 2 people who had loved the same woman from different distances. She told him what she wanted to do. She had been working on the list since the night she found the passage. She told him the whole of it now, and he listened without interrupting, and when she was finished there was a longer pause on the line. Dorothy would have approved, he said. I know, she said. That's how I knew it was right. The list, in the order she had written it in her notebook, the manuscript and printed books collection, in full, was to go on long-term institutional loan to 2 institutions. The first was the Rare Books Library at the University in New Haven that Dorothy had corresponded with since 1978, the letter asking about potential loan arrangements dating to 1981. The second was a regional museum in Burlington, Vermont, where Dorothy had made 2 prior loans of individual items and which had a collection preservation program she had cited approvingly in the correspondence files. The loan arrangements were not donations. The collection remained, in legal terms, the property of Evelyn Marsh. The institutions would have full access and full research rights and full exhibition rights, with the understanding that the collection would be maintained to the standards Dorothy had established, assessed annually by Aldrich's firm, and returned if the standards were not met. The art collection was to be divided. 20 of the 31 paintings were to go to the same 2 institutions in the same arrangement. 11 were to remain in Hargrove House. The house was to remain Hargrove House. She had thought about giving it a new name and had decided against it. The name belonged to Dorothy's 40 years of work in it, and changing the name would be the same kind of erasure that the family's decision to write Dorothy off in 1965 had been, and she had no interest in repeating that pattern. The house was to be converted into a residential library and study center. Writers and researchers working in the fields of rare books, art history, and archival study would be able to apply for residencies of between 2 weeks and 3 months, during which time they would have access to the library's research materials and to a collection of working tools, including the treadle sewing machine Dorothy had used for 40 years and the catalog that had organized the collection, because the catalog itself was a document of exceptional historical interest and deserved to be used. The financial instruments and the gold were to be liquidated over a period of 2 years, in a schedule Kessler was already drawing up, and the proceeds were to fund an endowment that would run the study center in perpetuity. Aldrich's firm would manage the endowment. Kessler would audit annually. Mara would serve on the board. This was the item on the list that had taken the longest to arrive at. Not because Evelyn had been uncertain about whether to ask her, but because she had wanted to be sure she was asking for the right reasons, and she had spent 2 weeks making sure the right reasons were the ones she was actually holding. The right reason was not that Mara was her daughter. The right reason was that Mara was the person in Evelyn's life who asked the same questions Dorothy had been asking, in a different field and a different register, but from the same underlying disposition. She asked where things came from. She asked who had made them and under what circumstances and what it had cost. She asked what happened to them when the people who made them were gone. She had been asking these questions since she was old enough to ask questions, and Evelyn had been answering them for 41 years, and she had always understood that Mara would eventually find the right room for those questions, but had not known until this April what room that would be. She called Mara and told her. Mara said, "Mom." "Yes. That's a big thing to ask." "It is," Evelyn said. "You don't have to." A silence on the line. The particular silence of a person who has already decided and is checking the decision from the inside. "I want to," Mara said. "I just needed to say it was big first." "It's very big," Evelyn said. "Okay," Mara said. "Yes. Tell me what you need." The town of Alderton learned about it the way small towns learn about things, which is not through announcements or press releases, but through the steady movement of information between people who trust each other enough to pass something along without embellishing it too much. Frances Park told her sister in Woodstock. Frances's sister told her book club. Someone in the book club mentioned it to the woman who ran the post office in Alderton, who already knew because she had been accepting couriered envelopes for Hargrove House for 6 weeks and had a professional sense of the difference between ordinary correspondence and correspondence that arrives with the urgency of something being confirmed. The librarian at the Alderton Public Library heard it from the postmistress and drove down Hargrove Lane on a Tuesday morning in May with a ceramic mug of coffee and a somewhat transparent excuse about checking whether the new occupant might want to be added to the library newsletter. Her name was Grace Burdick, and she was 44 years old, and she had been running the Alderton branch for 11 years with a budget that had not increased meaningfully since 2014. When she walked into the library at Hargrove House and saw the shelves, she sat down on the floor the way people kept sitting down in this house when a room showed them something they were not prepared for. She sat for approximately 40 seconds. Then she stood back up and looked at Evelyn with the expression of a professional who has just recalibrated several assumptions. "I heard there were books." Grace said. "There are books," Evelyn said. "I did not imagine this many." "Most people don't," Evelyn said. "Would you like coffee?" Grace Burdick became the first person from Alderton to whom Evelyn showed the passage and the cellar rooms. She showed her the landing shelves and the art room, and she watched Grace move through the paintings the way she had watched Mara move through them, slowly, looking at each one, processing something that had reorganized her sense of the possible. At the Bonheur, Grace stopped. "I have a print of a Bonheur at home," she said. "Above my kitchen table. I've had it since graduate school." "Which one?" Evelyn said. Grace told her. It was not one of the ones in the room. But it was the right period. The interior work from the 1920s, the particular quality of light that Bonheur had spent his whole career trying to capture and that he got, in Evelyn's view, more consistently than any other painter she had encountered in 40 years of looking at paintings and books. Dorothy's painting was from 1928. Grace's print was from 1927. The same light from the same year, filtered differently by the passage through reproduction. "Come whenever you want," Evelyn said. "The library is always open. The cellar rooms require me to be here." Grace came back the following week and the week after that, and eventually she simply had a key, which Evelyn gave her with the same directness with which she had been making decisions about this house, which was that if a thing was right you did it without requiring a process around it. The town was not large. 412 people at the last census, with a seasonal fluctuation that brought it to perhaps 500 in summer. It had seen its share of things over 2 centuries, and it absorbed this one the same way. The Congregational Church put a notice in its bulletin welcoming the new resident and the study center she was establishing. The general store put a small item on its community board. The volunteer fire chief, whose family had farmed the land adjacent to Hargrove Lane for 4 generations, drove up in his truck one morning and knocked on the door and said he had heard there was a library and would it be all right if he brought his daughter sometime. She was 9 and liked books. Evelyn said Saturday morning would be fine, and that the daughter should bring her best current question because the library was better approached with a question than without one. The daughter arrived on Saturday with her father and with a question she had clearly been preparing for several days. "How do you find a book that hasn't been written yet?" Evelyn sat with her in the wing chair for 40 minutes. They talked about the relationship between existing books and the books that have not yet been written, and the girl went home with 2 volumes from the library's reading copies and a look on her face that Evelyn recognized because she had worn it herself at 8 years old in a library that had given her more than she had known how to ask for. There was one conversation she had not expected and that she thought about for a long time afterward. Frances Park came to the house in June, the week after the announcement appeared in the library press. She came in the morning, on foot, from her own house a quarter-mile down the road, carrying a cloth bag with a jar of honey from her own hives and a bunch of lilacs from the bush at the end of her drive that was the most lavishly blooming lilac Evelyn had encountered in a long life of paying attention to lilacs. Frances was 81. She had the particular quality of a person who has earned their age, who wears it without apology and without the forced vigor of someone trying to appear younger than they are. She walked with a cane. Her eyes were clear and dark and missed nothing. Evelyn sat with her in the kitchen over the honey jar and a pot of tea, and they talked about Dorothy. Frances had known her for 50 years. She had been the person who brought groceries when the car stopped being driven. She had been the person who called twice a year to tell Evelyn that Dorothy was fine and working in the library. "Did you know?" Evelyn asked. "About the passage. About the rooms." Frances set her teacup down. She looked at the kitchen window. "I knew she was doing something important," she said. She had that particular look, once in a while, when she came to the door for the groceries. The look of a person who has just come up from a place they are glad to exist. I did not ask what the place was. You do not ask Dorothy Hargrove things like that. "No," Evelyn said. You wait, Frances agreed. She looked at her honey jar. "She told me once, maybe 15 years ago, that she had made provision for someone she trusted. She said, 'Fran, when I am gone, the right person is going to find what's in this house.' I said, 'How will they know to look?' And she said, 'Because they are the kind of person who looks.'" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "She said she had been watching you since you were born," Frances said. Not in a dramatic way. In the way of a woman who had decided who was worth watching and had made her decision and was simply patient about what the watching would eventually confirm. Frances picked up her teacup again. "I think she was lonely sometimes. I want you to know that. Not unhappy. She was not an unhappy person. But a person can be solitary and not lonely, and also lonely sometimes. And I think Dorothy was all 3 of those things at different hours of the same days." Evelyn thought about the letter in her coat pocket. She thought about the part of it she had not told Mara, about being 8 years old and asking Dorothy which books she had not yet read, and Dorothy saying that she was saving them for when there was more time. She thought about what it means to spend 40 years building something for someone else in a room by yourself, and to find the company of that work enough, and to find it not always enough, and to go on building anyway because the building was the point and the person it was for was the point, and the 40 years were what the point required. She was not lonely in the library, Evelyn said. No, Frances said. She was not lonely in the library. They sat in the kitchen in the June morning and drank their tea and did not say anything for a while, and the lilacs in the cloth bag on the counter made the whole kitchen smell like the month that always arrives later than you expect it to, and is always, when it comes, worth the waiting. The formal announcement of the discovery, which Aldrich had advised was necessary, and which Evelyn had agreed to on the condition that she controlled its terms and its timing, came in June. The Rare Books and Art World Press picked it up first, because Aldrich had contacts there, and because the story of a private collection of this scale, remaining completely unknown for 40 years, was the kind of story those publications existed to report. Then the regional press. Then the national outlets, which were interested primarily in the number, which Evelyn was prepared for, and which she declined to discuss in specific terms, because the number was not the point, and she was not going to spend the remaining years of her life explaining what the point was to people who kept asking about the number. She gave one interview to a writer at a quarterly journal devoted to private library history, which was the publication she trusted to understand what Dorothy had actually done. The interview ran to 4 hours across 2 afternoons in the library, with the writer at the long table under the east window and Evelyn in the wing chair by the fireplace. She told the story from the beginning. She told it the way Dorothy had written the catalog, precisely, without embellishment, with full credit given to Aldrich and Meta and Voss and Kessler and Miss Crane and Dorothy's neighbor Frances Park, who had called twice a year to say that Dorothy was fine and working in the library. She did not tell it as a story about money. She told it as a story about a woman who decided at 27 that the opinions of people who had already decided what she was worth were not a relevant factor in determining what she was worth, and who spent 40 years proving the point in complete silence, and who left the proof to the person she had decided was the right keeper. The piece ran in November. Its title was The Hidden Collection of Dorothy Hargrove, 1965 to 2024. The byline at the bottom of the piece described Dorothy as one of the most significant private collectors of the 20th century, a figure whose influence on the rare books and decorative arts markets had been profound without ever having been visible, precisely because she had chosen it that way. Evelyn read the piece in the wing chair on a November morning with the fire going in the fireplace and the hemlocks doing what hemlocks do in November, which is stand very still and very dark against the gray Vermont sky. She read it twice, and then she put it on the table, and she looked at the shelves. She had moved into the house in September. She had arranged for the Maple Street house to be rented to a young family from Woodstock who had 2 children and a dog and needed a yard, and she had taken from it the things that mattered, which were Gerald's bird feeder and the box of Dorothy's letters from under the bed and the small cloth-bound Dickinson with Dorothy's marginal notes. And she had brought them to Hargrove House and put them where they belonged. The feeder was in the sugar maple she had planted herself along the south wall of the garden, because the old maples along the drive were too tall. A pair of chickadees had found it within 3 days. She did not count the days between. She simply noted that they had come. The first residency application period had opened in October. There had been 47 applications in the first 2 weeks. Mara had driven up from Boston to help Evelyn read them, and they had spent a weekend at the long table under the east window going through them one by one, and they had made their decisions the way librarians make decisions about acquisitions, which is on the basis of specificity and seriousness and the particular quality of attention a person brings to the thing they are asking for. They had accepted 4 residents for the spring session. A manuscript scholar from the Netherlands who had been working for 12 years on a study of Flemish illumination. A biographer from New Zealand who was writing about a mid-century American painter whose work Dorothy had collected and who had never been the subject of a serious scholarly biography. A conservator from London who was developing new techniques for the stabilization of aging parchment. A novelist from Quebec who wrote in French and who had applied because, her letter said, she had read in a library press notice that the house had been built in 1823 and she had never worked in a house older than herself. Evelyn had accepted the novelist because of the last sentence. The other three because they were exactly the right people for the collection. She was a librarian. She knew how to match a person to a room. The cousins did not come back. Neil sent a Christmas card in December, which Evelyn received and placed on the mantel of the library fireplace alongside a card from Mara's children and a card from Aldrich and a card from Frances Park next door, who had continued her twice-yearly calls and who had cried very quietly on the phone when Evelyn told her what had been in the house all those years. Frances had said, "I always knew she was doing something in there. I just thought it was the books." Evelyn had said, "It was the books." Frances had thought about this for a moment, and then she had laughed, the laugh of a woman in her 80s who has lived long enough to find the right things genuinely funny. The first residents arrived. In April, exactly 1 year after the letter from Bellows and Crane had arrived at the bottom of a stack of grocery circulars at the house on Maple Street. The manuscript scholar from the Netherlands arrived on a Tuesday with 2 cases of equipment and a professional comm that suggested she had been in this kind of room before, though she said later that she had not been in one like this. The others came over the course of the following week, each one arriving in the library and stopping in the doorway the way Meta had stopped, the way anyone stops when a room shows them something they were not prepared for. Evelyn let them find their way in. She made coffee. She showed them the catalog system. She showed them the record books in the other section. She showed them where the light switches were in the cellar rooms. She did not show them the vault, because the vault contained Dorothy's letter, and Dorothy's letter was not for residency programs. Dorothy's letter was for Evelyn, and Evelyn kept it in the inside pocket of her everyday cardigan, where it had been since the morning she folded it on its creases and pressed it against her chest in the doorway of the iron room. She had not told Mara what was in the letter in full. She had told her the parts that Mara needed to know, which were the parts about the collection and the account and what Dorothy wanted done with them. The rest of it, the part about being 11 years old and standing in this library and asking which books Dorothy had not read yet and being told they were being saved for when there was more time, she had kept. She kept it the way Dorothy had kept things, without announcing it, without requiring acknowledgement from the thing being kept. There was more time now. She understood this more clearly every morning she walked into the library. She was 68 years old. She had $417 million in art and manuscripts and gold and bonds and a Geneva bank account, and she lived in a house that had been assessed at $43,000 12 months before, and she kept a bird feeder in the south garden, and she had 4 writers in residence in the 4 bedrooms of the upper floors, and she was, every single morning, the librarian. The wood thrushes came back in May, as they always come back. She heard them before she saw them, working the duff beneath the hemlocks in the early morning while she drank her coffee at the kitchen window. She did not count how many there were. She watched them work. On a Saturday in late May, she went down the passage alone, through the landing and down the 14 stairs, and through the art room and through the iron door. She stood in the vault in the dark for a moment before she turned on the light. She had installed a light in October, a simple fixture with a warm bulb, and she turned it on now and looked at the shelves, the shelving on the left wall that had held the gold now empty and clean, the shelving on the right still holding the archival boxes of bond certificates pending their schedule of liquidation, the small table at the back of the vault, the box on the table. She had replaced the letter in its box after reading it in the vault the first time, and she had not opened the box again. She opened it now. She took the letter out. She unfolded it on its creases in the light of the simple fixture, and she read it again, the whole thing, from the first sentence to the last. She read the part about Evelyn being 11 years old and asking about the library. She read the part about the $32,000 check and the green Buick and the Flemish manuscript in 1965. She read the part about putting Evelyn's name on the plate outside the door in February of 1982. She read the last paragraph. "There is more time now, Evelyn. It is yours." She folded the letter on its creases. She put it back in the box. She put the box back on the table. She turned off the light. She went up the 14 stairs and through the landing and through the passage and out into the library, where the morning light was coming in through the east window, and the catalog was on the long table, and the rolling ladder was on its brass track, and the wing chair by the fireplace was exactly where it had been every morning for the 40 years Dorothy had sat in it before Evelyn had. She sat down in the chair. She had letters to write. She had 4 residents in the house who would come down for breakfast in the next hour, and want to talk about their work. She had a call with Aldrich at 10 to discuss the second tranche of the liquidation schedule. She had a message from the Bodleian scholar asking whether she might extend her residency by 2 weeks, which Evelyn was going to say yes to because the scholar's work was serious and 2 additional weeks in the library would make it more so. She had the afternoon free, which she was going to spend reading the Flemish manuscript that Dorothy had bought in 1965 with the money her family had used to tell her she was the inconvenient one, because she had not yet read it, and it had been on the shelf for 60 years, and it was time. She picked up her notebook. She opened it to the list. She looked at the items she had crossed off and the ones she had not yet crossed off and the ones she had added since the original writing. She added 2 more items. She put the notebook down on the arm of the chair. Outside the east window, the May morning was doing what May mornings do in Vermont after a wet April. Everything at once, the lilacs and the apple blossom and the trillium in the wood margin and the first good light of a year that has finally decided to commit. The hemlocks were putting out their pale new growth along the tips of every branch, the new needles soft and almost yellow against the dark of the established ones, the color of something that has been waiting a long time and is now, without ceremony, beginning. The grandfather clock in the hall, which Evelyn had wound for the first time in October, and which had been keeping time ever since, ticked once in the quiet of the library. The birds were at the feeder in the south garden. She could hear them through the east window, the particular congress of the morning feeder that she had been listening to at various windows of various houses for 30 years, the chickadees and the white-throated sparrows, and, since she had moved into this house, a single nuthatch who came every morning and ate upside down on the suet cage and left without appearing to care what the other birds thought about this. She had been the nuthatch her whole life, she thought, doing the work upside down, in a way that looked strange from the outside and was simply correct from her own position, and not concerning herself with the opinions of the birds who ate the conventional way. Dorothy had been the nuthatch before her. Perhaps this was what Dorothy had understood at 27. That a woman who eats upside down and does not apologize for it will find, if she looks carefully at the trees of her life, that there is a great deal of food that the other birds cannot reach because they have not learned to hang that way. She picked up her pen. She turned to a new page in the notebook. She wrote the date at the top. She began the letter to the manuscript scholar from the Netherlands confirming the 2-week extension, and beneath it she began the letter to the director of the New Haven Rare Books Library regarding the opening of the loan arrangement, and she wrote in her own hand on cream-colored paper at the long table in the east light of the library at Hargrove House on a May morning in Vermont, while above her the 4 residents slept the late sleep of people who have been working hard in a room that asks a great deal of them, and around her the house settled into the sounds of a house that has been given back its purpose after a long time of having none. The creak of the old timbers, the tick of the copper pipes, the soft industry of a morning that is already well underway. She had not known, 12 months ago on a Tuesday in April, that a letter at the bottom of a stack of grocery circulars would bring her here. She had not known about the catalog or the passage or the iron door with her name on it, or the 40 years of one woman's quiet and complete and deliberate life, waiting to be found by the person who had been meant to find it since before that person was born. She knew now. She was here. The library was open. If you have ever known someone who built something important in silence, who worked without credit or audience for years, who left behind them a room that only made sense when you were finally standing inside it, tell me about them in the comments tonight. Tell me who they were. Tell me what they built. Tell me what you found when you opened the door. I will read every one. Sleep well. The library light is still on. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.